morning, everyone. Welcome back for week 3. Today we're going to take a look at the question, how can we easily summarize a training needs analysis? Specifically, we're working on our learning objective from last week, right, with our goal being to propose an appropriate training or consulting model based on student and client needs. Okay, we're going to look at how to do that today in a logic model. More on that later. But ideally, you will be able to describe student and client needs, define possible limitations, identify potential useful technologies, and hypothesize an optimal training model by the end of this unit. Now, we are still working through our ITLD process, right? We're working on the analysis stage and wrapping that up today. Remember, in the analysis stage, we do things like writing our training or consulting goal at a generalized level. We consider the instructional analysis, right? What does instructional mastery look like in this area? We consider the needs of our stakeholders, our learners' current knowledge levels, maybe specific needs of the employers. And finally, we consider our resources. What resources and tools are available and what kind of fit the job best, right? So this is what we're really focusing on in this analysis stage of our ITLD process. Furthermore, last week we talked about specific types of training and how being aware of the who, what, when, where, and why of our training help lead us to these ideas. Is a synchronous course or asynchronous course more appropriate for your training group? Is an in-person training or distance training more appropriate? Right? So knowing the who, what, when, where, and why kind of helps guide us towards these different training types. And today we're going to look at how to pitch that training type once you have an idea of where you want to go with the training. And today we're going to look at that. It's called a logic model. All right. Now today we're going to take a look at logic models. Logic models essentially are flowcharts that show how a program works. They're widely used in program evaluation since big companies and corporations need a way to check and see, is a program working? Should we continue to fund it? Should we make changes? That sort of thing. And a logic model is a way to quickly summarize these programs. Logic models originated in the late 1970s, but they've been really popularized since by the Kellogg Foundation. Right, the Kellogg Foundation gives out a ton of grants, so they need kind of a streamlined way to look at programs and judge if they want to fund them or keep funding them. And that essentially is the logic model. Okay, now the logic of the logic model shows that we start with inputs. Inputs lead to activities, which leads to outputs, and eventually lead to outcomes. Okay, so those are kind of the steps of a logic model. There's a couple different options on formatting, and if you search logic model, you might see a couple different ways that they're put together, but here is one I found that was quite good from Milstein and Chappell. Okay, you can see at the top, we have our purpose or mission statement. Then we plug in our inputs and resources. Okay, these are the things that are going into our program. These inputs and resources might have some constraints or barriers that we have to be mindful of. From there, the program should run activities. Okay, what is the program actually doing? That's the activities section. Those activities lead to outputs. Okay, as a result of this activity, what has changed? And finally, those changes lead to long-term effects. Right? Whether in the short term, midterm, or long term, these outputs of our program are changing, are having an effect that we want to measure. Okay? And then finally at the bottom here, we have the context or conditions. Okay, so this is an example of a logic model and a layout. There's a couple different layouts, but this is the one we'll be using this week for our class. And we're going to look at each one of these parts next. Okay, starting off with our purpose and context. When we're making our logic model, For our purpose, really, I'm just looking for general goals or aims of the program. Okay, what do you hope your training program is able to do? Speaking in general terms, clearly, so that anyone can understand it. As far as context, okay, if you are providing the context of your program, I should know kind of who has a problem, what is the problem, and why are we solving it. Okay, this is borrowed from the engineering design process. We're looking at problem statements, but I think that's a great way to give context. Right? What is the population we're training? What are we training them to do, and why? Next, the inputs are the factors that go into the training program. These are both people and resources. Okay, so when we talk about the different factors, the first one is the people that go into our program, the stakeholders. These hold a stake in the success of the program, all right? They're invested in it, either as trainees, right? They're investing in the program in hopes that it trains them to do something better. The trainers themselves, right? Maybe you're the one training people in this program, or maybe you're just writing it, and someone else is going to be the actual teacher in the classroom or trainer working with that program. Okay, so you have to be aware of, well, what do these trainers need? And also management and administration. Okay, so these are three kind of groups that are very important to consider. When we're talking our needs analysis, these are three groups that should be considered. Right? What do my trainees need? What are their initial knowledge levels? What is their time availability? How about my trainers? What's their knowledge level like? What is their availability? Are they comfortable with one training method or another? Or in-person versus digital, that sort of thing. And then finally, you got to know what your management and administration need, because maybe not everyone can take the training at once. Maybe they can only take the training one at a time, because we need people working the floor. Right? So when we're talking training and when we're talking the business world, you really got to know the needs of your management and administration, because that might look very different than a traditional classroom setup. Additionally, we should consider the resources. How much funding do you have, right? About physical resources or digital resources. These are all important things to consider. Do you have the funding to pull off your program? Do you have the funding to hire additional trainers? Do we have the physical resources to run our training program? Okay, do you need whiteboards so that students can write something and show it to the trainer? Well, do you have those? Do you have calculators for everyone? Do you have a room big enough to host your training, right? These are all things to be considered in that needs analysis stage of ADDIE, as well as digital resources, right? Things like drive space online, capability to push out instructional videos or to save them on a shared storage, right? So lots of things to consider when you're talking about what goes into your training program. Okay, the next stage of the logic model, once we've ironed out the inputs, the things going into our program, well, some activities need to take place, right? These are learning activities. These are training activities. These are activities where we're maybe creating materials once we've figured out what this program needs, right? So a lot occurs in the activities section. If we're talking the ADDIE model, we're looking at the design and development phases, where we might have to diagnose potential problems on the job site. If we're talking more a consulting gig, right? Maybe you have to go find the problem first. And then once we know the issue, we should be designing lessons addressing these problems or addressing the content that we need to teach. Maybe we're developing instructional materials. Okay, so maybe in a consulting job, you diagnose a problem, you design a lesson on how to fix it, and then you develop a video that we can push out to employees on how to solve that problem, right? So this is an example of what that might look like, that design and development phase. Additionally, we should be implementing the training during the activities phase, so that implementation part of ADDIE. right? Maybe that's the part where we push the instructional videos out to employees and they try them out. And then maybe we give a follow-up quiz and survey as well. So that assessment portion can also come in the activity stages. Under the outputs category of the logic model go our results, right? Things that we can see have immediately changed as the result of our training program. This is essentially us collecting all of our assessment data so that we can better judge our program. Okay, this might include things like completion rate. Did people take the training? Did they complete the program? Right? Were they present? Attendance, right, is something you can look at as a potential output. You can look at formative assessment. Maybe your trainers were observing the trainees throughout the activity and they have feedback to give you. Hey, this is working. Hey, this is not working. Here are our observations and notes, right? That formative assessment. We also might get some summative assessment. Maybe it's content-based, right? Maybe they take a test at the end of the program and we have data on their test and how they scored. Okay, maybe it's opinion-based. Maybe it's a survey. Okay, in both of these cases, we can do before-after to measure growth, or we can do a one-time measurement at the end. Okay, you have a little flexibility there on kind of what's best for your training program. I'll leave that up in the air. But you should at least be considering the content and our trainers' attitudes, our trainees' attitudes, right? Their opinions on how did it go? Was it successful? Is it helpful? That sort of thing. Okay, so these are all the outputs of our program. Remember, these are immediate results. These are things you can look at right away once the training program ends and try to justify, did the program work or not? And then finally, we finish our logic model by listing the outcomes. These are the short-term, midterm, and long-term results of the program. Okay, this might vary depending on the type of training program you're running. I think Kellogg typically looks at the short term as 1 to 6 months. The midterm is 6 months to a couple years, and then long term as multiple years. Okay. And we're looking at some different options here. In the short term, you might be looking at attitude changes or skill increases. Right? After taking the training, do our employees feel prepared to take on their day job now? Did their attitude change? Okay, do they have the skills they didn't have before? Are they able to pass tests and perform skills in the short term that they were taught to? If we look at midterm, we can consider the retention of the above. Okay, how about their attitude and skills? Do they still feel that way or test that way a year down the line, right? Is it still holding up? The attitude and skill changes that we observed earlier, is it still there 2 years down the line, right? That's what we're looking at in the midterm results. Or maybe we're looking at, does that skill transfer? Okay, if we learned a very specific skill, did that transfer to general job performance? Okay, maybe we have some other statistics that can justify whether that skill did or did not transfer that we can look at. And long term, okay, the results of that skill transfer. Okay, maybe your skill is how to climb a ladder safely. And our skill transfer in the midterm, we're looking at a reduction of workplace accidents. And in the long term, we're showing a decrease in insurance costs and emergency room visits, right? So you can kind of picture the parts. We're teaching them a skill. We're hoping the skill transfers and we can observe it in the workplace. And we're hoping that long-term results in us seeing some changes in the program or changes in the company that we want to see. Okay, so that's kind of how to think of outcomes, short-term, midterm, and long-term, right? What does that skill do? How does it transfer in the midterm? And what does that look like in our long-term data, right? Having that idea worked out ahead of time really helps you gauge the effectiveness of a program. Okay, and here you can see an example from healthcare. In this case, it's a program on controlling tuberculosis. You can see they have their purpose or mission statement, speaking in general terms about their goal. They have their inputs and resources. Okay, they need trained staff to run their program. The staff needs access to some health info systems, right? A digital resource there. They also need access to labs and pharmacies. Okay, so that's a physical resource. That's a lab space. And they also need organizations. Okay, they have some lists of constraints or barriers that are possible things that they might have to worry about. Next, they have activities. This is what the program is going to do. So in this case, this tuberculosis program, they want to identify cases, they want to identify contacts, and they want to diagnose the causes. Okay, so that is what this program will do. Now, what information can they collect from this program? Well, they will know how many people begin treatment and how many people complete treatment. Okay, so they get a completion rate based on their outputs. And the long-term effects, okay, the short, mid, and long-term, what do we hope to see? Well, we hope to see more people cured, a reduction in TB rate, and the improvement of health status overall. Okay, so these are the three variables they're going to track to determine the overall effectiveness of this program. Okay, so this is a logic model. Essentially, it is a way to outline all of our variables. Okay, what are our variables that we have to consider going in? That's the inputs. What are the factors we're going to have to design and develop? That's our activities. Then we're going to implement them and we get outputs out. And hopefully that translates to our long-term effects or our outcomes. Okay, so here is a logic model example. I'm going to show you another one on the next slide, a little more simpler, more aimed at education, but there's an example for you. Okay, let's take a look at a logic model example that's a little less healthcare focused and a little more training focused. Okay, this one will do super simple topic. Our purpose now is to train campus employees to host a Zoom class. Okay, and figuring out what that entails. Okay, so starting with our purpose, really general statement. We're not getting into the nitty-gritty details of objectives yet. We just want to provide kind of an overall goal or purpose. In this case, just training employees to host a Zoom class. Okay, we'll give a little more context at the bottom. In this case, we're training our university professors and graduate assistants. Why are we training them? Well, they need a refresher training for hosting our Zoom meetings as some of our policies have changed. Okay, so in our context, we're providing the who, our professors and graduate assistants, the what, we're training them for hosting Zoom meetings, and the why, because policies have changed. Next, we can look at the actual categories of our logic model, the inputs, the activities, the outputs, and the outcomes, and that'll kind of help build our model out here. So starting with inputs, okay, these are the people you would consider, or the ideas you would consider in that analysis stage of ADDIE. Okay, so if our professors and GAs are taking the training, we would want to know, well, what do they already know? Are they already hosting Zoom classes? And this is just a refresher training on the new policies. Or maybe they're new to Zoom meetings and we used a different provider last year for the online meetings, right? So you would have to go out and do your homework and figure out, what do these professors and GAs know already? What do they need to learn to reach proficiency? Okay, what does hosting a Zoom class look like to the university? What does hosting a good Zoom class consist of? And how do we teach those skills, right? These are all things to consider in that analysis stage. And if we do a good job, we'll find some natural limitations within our training. Okay, in this case, maybe we considered, hey, to run our training, we need classrooms and computers. Well, there's only 2 classrooms that we can run this training at in the university, and there's 20 computers per room. Okay, so those are possible limitations. Additionally, professors and GAs are busy, so maybe scheduling is another limitation that we have to be ready to work around. Okay, but this is just a nice way to kind of write everything up so you know what to be aware of. Okay, you know what to consider. Next up, once we've considered these inputs and limitations, okay, we finish the analysis stage of that ADDIE process, we're going to be looking to design and develop some activities. Okay, maybe you're designing your lesson from the top down. We're writing our objectives. We're figuring out what goes in each part and how to chunk things appropriately. And then we have to develop the actual materials. In the case of our Zoom training, maybe that's handouts, maybe that's PowerPoint slides. We can add in some assessment. We're going to add a quiz and a survey into this training. Okay, then we actually have to schedule the training. Maybe email an announcement of when the training will take place, and then run that in-person lesson. Okay, so you can see in the activity stage, we have the design, we have the development, and then we have the implementation of the lesson. Okay, so the next 3 stages of that ADDIE model are occurring in our activities. From there, once we run our activities, we should get some results, some outputs. Right? Looking at just this really basic lesson here, well, we should know at the end of it how many employees attended our lesson, how many employees completed the lesson, right? They finished it and they took the quiz and survey. In an ideal world, we would collect some trainer observations, right? Get some of that formative assessment. We would get quiz results and survey results. Okay, so you can see we get quite a bit of outputs here that we can use to gauge the successfulness of our training. And then finally, our outcomes. This is the long-term success of our training. Maybe you provided an initial survey. You asked employees, hey, do you feel comfortable hosting a Zoom class? Maybe you asked them that at the end of the training originally. Well, you could do a follow-up survey 6 months later. Hey, do you still feel comfortable now that you've maybe tried to host a class? Were those skills valuable or not valuable, right? We could do a follow-up and see, did these skills transfer? Okay, we can also look at some long-term data, some bigger kind of program level data. Maybe we need to know how many Zoom courses we have. If that keeps going up, then we can consider our program a success, especially if we can keep the number of policy violations down. Okay, maybe there's a lot of security policies that are present in the university's Zoom rules. Okay, well, if we're teaching a lot of courses and we're not getting policy violations, we know our training is successful. Okay, so that's kind of, this is an example of a logic model. This is what we're trying to think of. We're trying to think of what goes into our training. What do we have to do during the training? What data are we going to collect immediately? And what data can we look at long term? Okay, and using all of that, we can judge, is this training successful? Does this training need to be adjusted? Do we need to maybe tweak a couple parts to get this training to run better so that we get less policy violations? Or maybe we just make it more efficient. Maybe we can make our training shorter because it's shown to be very effective, but it's just using up a lot of our employees' time. So we want to see if we can maybe get it down to a 5-minute training from a 15-minute, right? So kind of a lot of things to consider there. There's a lot of variables in the world of training, and we're just trying to practice writing these out. And you guys will make something like this this week for our logic model project. Okay, and I'll show you next kind of how I built this out in PowerPoint, but you'll also have the option to use other forms of technology if you prefer. You don't have to use PowerPoint for our logic model here, but I'll I'll include some PowerPoint stuff at the end for anyone that does want to create something like this in PowerPoint. All right, taking a look at what needs to be done this week. Okay, you guys have watched the video so far. I do have one more reading resource for you to check out on developing a logic model. Okay, this is where I got the visual you saw in the PowerPoint. Here, they do call the last category effects instead of outcomes, but that's all right. This does a pretty good job going over a logic model and what goes into it. So I would suggest giving this a read or a skim. If that is a little confusing, there's a few more follow-up options here on logic models. And these are all just a couple pages. I'm going over that same kind of info of what goes in inputs, what goes in outputs, activities, and that sort of thing. So a bunch of different tools there to check out on logic models. As far as project 1, you're going to be creating your own logic model. That'll be similar to the example I just showed you in the PowerPoint. Okay, this is just, it's listed as a discussion post, but I want you guys to just submit your picture of your logic model by 9:15. You do not have to do any replies this week. I just like creating it as a discussion post so that we can look and see what others have done. Okay, obviously your grades will not be visible for anyone else there, but just so that we can see each other's logic models and what people are working on. But you'll submit here on the project 1, just that picture format. And in this case, you're making a logic model. Okay, you've been hired to manage a new training or consulting program. It's up to you whether this is a real life problem or whether this is totally imaginary. But you're just making that logic model. You're including the training purpose and context. You're including a section for inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. Okay? So nice and simple there. I showed you a little rubric. This is kind of what I'm looking for. So when I go to grade this, I'll be checking, do you have a purpose statement included in your model at the top, right? That'll be a couple points. Do you include your context statement at the bottom? Okay, are you recording at least 2 stakeholders, at least 2 resources, things like that? Okay, so this is what I'm going to be looking for when I grade your logic model. So please let me know if you have any questions there. As far as what program to create your logic model in, you have lots of options. Since a logic model is essentially just a flow chart, you can use PowerPoint or Google Slides, like I did, and just create a quick and easy slide. There's also some fancier options. Prezi makes slides. Lucidchart, Miro are options for making flow charts. You can also talk with ChatGPT, try out some AI to help figure out what goes in these different categories. And ChatGPT also does have some ability to convert directly to a chart. I think it outputs into Miro, so that might be something you try out. Obviously, if you're using ChatGPT, make sure you're still doing the majority of the work, that you're just using it for ideas or to see what it can do, not to do the entire assignment for you. But that is a resource out there, and that is technology that you can use. So lots of options there. But this week, right, we're checking out logic models. We're submitting our assignment by next Monday on that logic model. That's your requirements. You can stop watching the video now if you feel like you can run with that. Or if you'd like a little help on the PowerPoint side of things, I'm going to go over just real quick how I set up that logic model template in PowerPoint. Okay, so have a great week. If you're going to stop here, or if you want some tips on PowerPoint, that'll come next. All right, so let's take a look at how someone might create a quick logic model in PowerPoint. You can do this in any program that you can make flowcharts in, but I tend to gravitate towards PowerPoint because the jobs I've always worked have had Microsoft Office Suite. So this is the tool that I've always had for free or from my job. So this is the tool that I've practiced using quite a bit. All right, so let's take a look at if we wanted to make a flowchart, we could start by just deleting our boxes already here. Okay, so you can just click and delete those text boxes. If I wanted to insert some shapes to make my flowchart, I can go up here to the Insert tab. We'll click on Shapes. Personally, I like using either rectangles or rounded rectangles, just because you tend to run out of space for text if you use ovals. Okay, so I would recommend either rectangles or rounded rectangles. And you can just click and drag to whatever size you need. Say there. And step 1 in our logic model will be purpose. Okay, so something like that. We can write that in. Anytime you want to write in a shape, you just double click on the shape. You also have lots of options. At the top, you'll see we got the shape format tab that gives us all sorts of options for editing our shape. You can also change the text, either through the text here or going to the home page. Well, why don't we make this black text? And let's change the fill of the shape by clicking on Shape Fill. And do something a little lighter. How about a light orange? Okay, I usually like light colors because it's very easy to see dark text over lighter colors. That's just something to keep in mind. You probably want to be aware of using a dark color and dark text. That might be really hard for some people to see. Okay, so let's start with our purpose statement. That looks good. We can adjust the width a bit if we want. And something I'm a big fan of in the shape format tab here in PowerPoint is the Align tool. Okay, so right away, depending on where this is, we want it in the top, in the center. We can use Align to achieve that. Okay, so you have two options. One is Align Middle, that'll put it in the middle vertically, and the other is Align Center, and that'll put it in the middle going left to right. So why don't we start, get that purpose lined up. That looks good. We can copy and paste that, bring it to the bottom. Notice we have our grid lines to show us that this is lined up. That's awesome. Maybe just move that to the bottom. We'll call that context. Okay, this will be what goes in our context box. And now we have our purpose, we have our context. We just need our input, activities, output, and outcome. Okay, so we can go back to our shapes tool and drag that in. Or what I like to do once I've formatted one shape is we can copy and paste, Control C, Control V. And now we can just reshape this to be our vertical ones here. So maybe something like this. This will be our inputs. We can copy and paste that a couple times. We'll need 4 running across. So now we have inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. Okay. Now, once again, we can use this Align tool as our friend. Okay, what I did just now is I shift clicked these 4 new categories, okay, to select them all. So shift and click on each one. And we can use our Align tool now to make sure they're lined up on the top. And we can also distribute them horizontally. Okay, so you can see there, now we're lined up on top. We're distributed horizontally. So we have the same gap in each one. This is starting to look pretty professional. One thing to notice, our gap on the left side and the right side is a little off. So what we can do is just click on the right side here and drag it to where it matches on the left and right. You see we got that little measurement tool on the bottom saying, hey, that gap is the same on the left and right. Perfect. And then I can distribute Using my align tool again, distribute horizontally. Now we're spaced out nice and perfect. Okay, we have the same space on the left and the right, the same gaps in between. This is starting to look pretty good. Okay, we can add in our text by just double clicking. We can use enter to add spaces. Let's see our inputs. Maybe we have our learners, trainers, and we'll just say we have resource 1 and resource 2. Okay, that's what's going in our input field. If I want, I can bold this top one. Okay, we have some other options. What I did personally is I aligned all of the inputs to the left here. Okay. Now we're getting a nice clean looking graph here. We can do that formatting for each one to add in our purpose, activities, outputs, outcomes, all that jazz. And then the last thing we will have to add is arrows. Okay, so to add arrows, we can go to shapes and arrow. I'm fine if you guys want to use the one-sided arrow or the two-sided arrow. Doesn't matter to me as long as we know that inputs leads to activities. Okay, notice as I'm drawing this arrow, it's going left to right only, not up or down. That is because I'm holding shift. And you can see it'll do it on a 45 if I needed to as well. But if you hold shift when you draw that arrow, we can get that nice vertical or horizontal arrow there. Now that is pretty hard to see, so we can go to shape outline at the top here. We can change the weight to make it a thicker line, maybe to 4.5. And we could change the color as well. So maybe we just go a black arrow there. Well, that looks like a pretty good arrow. We formatted it. We can just copy and paste to add them into the next two sections. And we have a basic logic model here. Okay, you can go in and add in the rest of the text. But as far as the gist of how to create that flow chart, okay, we've kind of gone through all the steps. Once this flow chart is done, you can file, save as, okay, and save as, here, why don't I show this? Hopefully I'm not giving anything too crazy away there. All right. So when you go file, save as, you can click the picture drop down and find JPEG. Okay, this is a way to do a picture. You can also use Ping and some other ones. I like JPEGs personally. And then when you go to save it, it'll ask you which slides you want to export. You can choose to export all the slides if you want a picture for each one, or just this one if you just want to save that logic model. Okay, but that is how you can save just that one picture to get your logic model. And that's kind of the gist of it this week. So you can go through, you can create your model just how I showed you, fill in all these tables, do save as JPEG, and then when you upload that into the discussion, you're good for the week. That is how to make a logic model in PowerPoint. Right, so hopefully that was helpful. Appreciate you if you stayed for the whole video, and you guys have a great week.